Tonight, you are going to inherit half of Europe, not through war, not through conquest, not through any particularly impressive feat of strategy or valor. You are going to inherit half of Europe the same way the most powerful dynasty in Western history built its empire, through a series of extremely well-organized family dinners. Settle in. Pull your blanket a little tighter, because the story you're about to hear is one of the strangest in all of recorded history. It involves crowns, castles, centuries of political genius, and a jawline so architecturally ambitious that court painters across Europe quietly developed a specialty in creative lighting. We're talking about the Habsburgs. And before we go any further, yes, you already know where this is going. Everyone who has heard the name Habsburg knows roughly where this is going. The cousin marriages, the genetic consequences, the dynasty that slowly folded in on itself like a very expensive piece of origami. But what most retellings miss, what gets lost when the story becomes a punchline, is how reasonable it all seemed at the time, how logical, how carefully considered. The Habsburgs weren't naive. They weren't careless. They were, by almost any measure, brilliant. They just had a very unfortunate blind spot. And that blind spot is what we're here to explore tonight. You wake up in a Habsburg palace sometime in the early 1500s, and the first thing you notice is the sheer size of everything. The bed is enormous. The ceilings are preposterous. The tapestries on the walls depict battles won by your ancestors, saints performing miracles, and if you look closely, several faces that bear a striking resemblance to your own. That last detail will become relevant later, much later, in a way that nobody in this palace will find particularly amusing. For now, though, everything is impressive. Servants appear before you've finished yawning. Someone has already laid out clothing that costs more than a middling village earns in a year. Outside your window, a city stretches toward the horizon, a city that technically belongs to your family, along with several other cities, and the countries those cities happen to sit inside. This is the Habsburg reality. Not a kingdom, a collection of kingdoms: Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, which was famously neither holy nor Roman, nor, depending on who you asked, particularly well organized, but which nevertheless came with an impressive title and extensive paperwork. And eventually, vast territories across the Atlantic, the Americas, with their silver mines and their bewildering scale, all of it falling somehow under the Habsburg name. How does one family come to control this much of the world? Not, as I said, through war, or at least not primarily through war. The Habsburgs certainly fought wars when they had to, but fighting wars was expensive, inconvenient, and had the frustrating tendency to leave large portions of Europe on fire, which made the resulting territories considerably less valuable. The Habsburgs had a better idea: marriage. The architect of this strategy was Emperor Maximilian I, a man who looked at the map of Europe in the late 1400s and had what can only be described as a romantic revelation. Every kingdom on that map represented not just a territory, but a family. And every family, however proud, however powerful, had daughters to marry off and sons who needed wives. And every marriage contract, if written cleverly enough, was a deed of ownership deferred. Maximilian's famous maxim, the one historians love to quote, was Bella gerent alii, tu Felix Austria nube. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It sounds gentle, civilized, like the kind of foreign policy you'd frame and hang in a diplomat's study. And in practice, it worked with astonishing efficiency. In 1477, Maximilian married Mary of Burgundy. In a single ceremony, the rich trading cities of the Low Countries, Brussels, Antwerp, Ghent, places buzzing with wealth and merchant ships, drifted into Habsburg hands. No siege required. Just a wedding, a banquet, and a legally binding contract. He then arranged his son Philip's marriage to Joanna of Castile, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Suddenly, the rising Atlantic superpower, the kingdom that was just beginning to build a global empire in the Americas, was connected to the Habsburgs not by conquest, but by in-laws. And just like that, the world changed. Maximilian sat back, looked at what he had accomplished, and one Imagines immediately began planning the next wedding. The genius of this system was its simplicity. Every royal family in Europe was already somewhat related to every other royal family. The aristocratic web was already tangled. The Habsburgs simply pulled the threads with more intentionality than anyone else. By the early 1500s, Habsburg relatives occupied thrones across multiple regions. Their influence had stretched from the Alps to the Atlantic without a single decisive battle to explain it. Their dynasty had become the dominant force in European politics through nothing more than a very aggressive wedding planning strategy. Of course, and here is where the story begins its slow turn, this strategy had a small structural problem. The more territories you collected through marriage, the more important it became to keep those territories inside the family. Allowing a daughter to marry into a foreign dynasty meant handing power to strangers. It meant children who might inherit Habsburg lands without Habsburg loyalties. It meant carefully assembled collections of kingdoms drifting toward people with different surnames, unacceptable. And so the circle began, very slowly, to close. Let us imagine, for a moment, that you are a royal matchmaker in the Habsburg court of the mid-1500s. Your office is a quiet room somewhere in a palace. Maps cover one wall. The other walls are covered in genealogical charts, enormous parchment documents filled with names, dates, and tiny inked crowns marking anyone of sufficient importance. Your job is not to arrange happy marriages. Your job is to arrange useful ones. A prince has come of age. The court needs a bride. You begin your search. Foreign dynasties are reviewed and one by one set aside. The French have different interests. The English are unpredictable. The Italians are complicated. The Ottomans are entirely out of the question. What remains, after careful consideration, is what always remains, the list of acceptable royal spouses, which, when you examine it closely, has a striking geographic concentration. They are, most of them, already sitting at the same dinner table. This is not conspiracy. It's not even particularly unusual by the standards of the era. Royal families everywhere practiced cousin marriage. The goal was always the same: preserve alliances, protect accumulated wealth, keep titles within recognizable bloodlines. The Habsburgs simply pursued this logic with more dedication than most, and across more generations than anyone had really done the accounting on. And so, cousin marriages became routine. Not shocking, not scandalous routine. The way tax collection was routine, or correspondence with distant governors, or the perpetual low-level political crisis somewhere in the Italian states. A princess marries her second cousin. Their son marries a princess from another branch of the family who shares 2 sets of great-grandparents with him. Their daughter marries a first cousin. On paper, the empire remains intact. The crowns stay in the family. The political logic holds. The family tree, however, has begun doing something that trees are not supposed to do. It is growing inward. If you could see the Habsburg genealogical chart spread across a table today, and researchers have reconstructed it in remarkable detail, it would not look like a tree. Trees have a directionality to them. They start from a root and branch outward, each generation reaching further into new territory. The Habsburg chart looks more like someone tried to braid it. The same names recur. The same ancestors appear in multiple positions within the same person's lineage. Relationships that should be simple: grandparents, cousins, aunts, become layered with redundancy, one connection stacking on top of another like geological sediment. At one point in the Spanish Habsburg line, a researcher counting the distinct ancestors within a certain number of generations would find far fewer individuals than the mathematics of reproduction demands. The branches were reconnecting before they had a chance to spread. No one at the time had a word for this process. No one in the courts of Madrid or Vienna understood why a family tree might need to grow outward to remain healthy. The concept of inherited biological information, that some piece of each parent is transmitted to each child, that rare harmful variants accumulate when parents share too many ancestors. This was centuries away from being discovered. What the Habsburg court had instead was a very successful political strategy and a growing collection of portrait painters who were developing a subtle but unmistakable specialty. Court painters in the Habsburg tradition learned something that no art school explicitly teaches: how to depict a specific architectural feature of the human face in a way that reads as distinguished. The feature in question was the lower jaw. In a healthy face, the upper and lower jaws align in a way that allows the lips to close without effort. In the increasingly frequent faces appearing in Habsburg portraits, the lower jaw extended forward past the upper jaw, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, in what modern medicine calls mandibular prognathism. The condition itself isn't life-threatening. It affects appearance, and in more pronounced cases, it affects the mechanics of eating and speaking. But it is, critically, visible. You can see it in a portrait. Court painters saw it. They adapted. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. Turn the head slightly upward, which foreshortens the jaw in the viewer's sightline. Use shadow to soften the lower face. Add a substantial beard in certain decades, helpful for disguise and also fashionable. Employ elaborate collars, ruffs, chains of gold, anything that draws the eye toward the symbols of power and away from the center of the face. The effect was diplomatic rather than deceptive. The paintings were not lies. They were simply optimistic interpretations. But here is the thing about optimistic interpretations of physical reality. They have limits. By the middle of the dynasty's history, the paintings were doing everything they could, and the Habsburg jaw was still the most recognizable feature in the royal portrait galleries of Europe. Diplomats visiting foreign courts could identify a Habsburg ruler from across a reception hall without introduction. The family resemblance had become, as one historian would later describe it, essentially a brand that nobody had actually chosen, and that no amount of creative lighting could retire. You are now living under the rule of Charles V. This is not, by most measures, a comfortable place to be. Charles V inherited an extraordinary amount of territory simultaneously. Spain and its overseas empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Austrian hereditary lands, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, and the psychological weight of governing all of it simultaneously appears to have been, even for someone raised from birth to rule, genuinely overwhelming. The portrait painters who worked with Charles V captured something that the Habsburg tradition of dignified presentation struggled to fully conceal: exhaustion. The famous Habsburg profile is already present: the forward jaw, the long narrow face, but there is something else in the eyes. The look of a man who has been reading catastrophically urgent correspondence since approximately the age of 16. Charles governed through one of the most chaotic periods in European history. The Protestant Reformation was fracturing the religious unity of his empire. The French King Francis I had made a hobby of opposing Habsburg interests at every available opportunity. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent was advancing westward with a determination that made comfortable sleep difficult. And simultaneously, the Americas were being colonized under Habsburg authority, which meant an entire additional hemisphere's worth of administrative complexity. He spent most of his reign in motion. Palaces in Spain, Germany, Italy, the Low Countries. Wherever the latest crisis was loudest, Charles eventually appeared, surrounded by advisors and accompanied by a headache that one imagines was essentially permanent. And then, remarkably, he stopped. In 1556, Charles V abdicated. He divided his empire, Spain, and the overseas territories to his son Philip, the German lands and imperial title to his brother Ferdinand, and retreated to a monastery in Extremadura, where he spent his final years in quiet, listening to the church bells rather than the ceaseless noise of European politics. For a man who had once commanded the largest empire in the Western world, it was a notably peaceful exit. The empire continued, now divided. The family strategy continued. The marriages continued. The portrait painters continued developing their techniques, and the family tree continued, very quietly, folding inward. Growing up Habsburg was, by most objective measures, a strange experience. You were born into a world where the boundaries between family, politics, and geography had been deliberately blurred for generations. Your cousins were potential spouses. Your uncles might be foreign kings. The person sitting across from you at formal dinner, that slightly familiar face with the slightly familiar profile, was probably related to you through at least 3 separate branches of the family tree, and the adults in the room were already running the arithmetic on your future. Your education was thorough. Languages, Latin, certainly, and several modern European languages, depending on which portion of the empire you were expected to eventually manage. Diplomacy, how to receive ambassadors, how to project authority, how to smile at foreign dignitaries who might secretly be calculating your dynasty's vulnerabilities. Theology, the political importance of appearing holy, was not lost on the people who had been ruling by divine right for generations. What your education did not include was anything that would have been useful to know. No one in the schoolroom explained that when closely related individuals have children, there is an increased probability that rare harmful traits that require 2 copies of a gene to manifest, copies that a more genetically diverse population would rarely bring together in a single individual, will appear. No one drew diagrams. No one ran calculations. The monk Gregor Mendel, who would eventually discover the basic rules of inheritance through a famous series of experiments involving pea plants, had not yet been born. The concept of a gene would not exist for centuries. What the tutors taught instead was the doctrine of bloodline purity. Royal blood was not merely symbolic. It was, in the genuine belief of the era, functionally different from common blood. Kings ruled by divine right, which implied a divine selection process, which implied that the blood flowing through royal veins carried something the common population did not possess. Diluting that blood with common ancestry was not merely socially unacceptable. It seemed, to people operating within this framework, genuinely dangerous. And so the marriages continued. Cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, each union celebrated as preservation rather than recognized as accumulation. The empire looked strong. The logic felt sound. The children kept being born, and the portrait painters kept tilting heads, adjusting shadows, and reaching for their softest brushes. In a royal dynasty, the word heir carries a weight that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point. An heir is not merely a child. An heir is a guarantee. An heir is the answer to the question every rival dynasty, every ambitious noble, every neighboring kingdom is perpetually asking. What happens when the current ruler dies? Without a clear answer to that question, European history had a well-documented tendency to produce wars. These wars had a reliable pattern. A ruler dies without a clear successor. Multiple claimants emerge. The claimants disagree. Armies form around the disagreement. Historians later write about it with the slightly wearied tone of people documenting a pattern they have seen before. For the Habsburgs, this meant that every royal pregnancy was a political event. Every birth was watched. Every child's health was monitored with an intensity that must have felt, to the children themselves, somewhere between attentive and suffocating. And here is where the marriage strategy, so politically successful, so seemingly rational, began to complicate itself in ways nobody had the tools to diagnose. Closely related parents, as modern genetics would eventually explain, share a higher proportion of their genetic material than distantly related parents. This matters because every human genome carries variants that, in a single copy, cause no harm. But in two copies, the copies that a child inherits from each parent, can cause significant problems. These variants are rare in large, genetically diverse populations. But in a population that keeps marrying within the same small circle of relatives, they accumulate. The court physicians of the Habsburg era had none of this framework. When royal children were born sickly, or developed slowly, or struggled with difficulties that defied the standard treatments, the explanations available were theological divine punishment, or simply God's will. Humoral, an imbalance of the four bodily fluids that medieval medicine held responsible for all health. Or simply unlucky. The doctors tried their best. They prescribed herbal remedies, adjusted diets, recommended specific climates, occasionally employed bloodletting, which was, in the 1500s and 1600s, considered a first-rate medical intervention, rather than the deeply counterproductive practice we now recognize it to be. None of it addressed the actual problem. The actual problem was being compounded with every generation, quietly, invisibly, in a mechanism so small that it would not be understood until the 19th century, and not fully mapped until the 21st. But the children kept being born. The empire kept needing heirs. The marriages kept being arranged. And the portrait painters, bless them, kept doing what they could. Philip II of Spain received, from his father Charles V, the most valuable inheritance in the world. Spain and its overseas empire, the Spanish Netherlands, large portions of Italy, the ships crossing the Atlantic with their silver, the governors managing vast colonial territories, the priests converting indigenous populations, the fleets making Spain, by almost any measure, the dominant naval power of the 16th century. Philip also received the Habsburg marriage strategy, along with the implicit expectation that he would continue it. He did. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his cousin. Not a distant cousin in the modern colloquial sense, the kind of cousin you barely know and only see at holidays, but a double cousin, meaning they shared grandparents on both sides of their respective families. Their genetic relatedness was higher than most cousin pairings. The match was, politically, completely logical. Portugal was powerful, wealthy, and geographically adjacent. Keeping the alliance close was simply good governance. Their son, Don Carlos, was born in 1545 to considerable celebration. The celebration faded As the prince grew older, historical accounts of Don Carlos describe a young man whose difficulties were visible and progressive. He was physically fragile. His behavior was erratic in ways that went beyond the ordinary temperamental difficulties of royal children. He struggled with impulse control. His health deteriorated. The chronicles of the time, written by people who had no framework for explaining what they were witnessing, described his condition in terms of character flaws, unfortunate temperament, or simply the particular cruelty of fate. Philip eventually confined his son to his chambers, a decision that speaks to how seriously the court took the prince's instability, given the political consequences of effectively imprisoning an heir. The Habsburg marriage strategy had, for perhaps the first time, produced consequences visible enough to worry even the dynasty's most committed practitioners. Philip continued the strategy anyway. His fourth marriage, to Anna of Austria, connected the Spanish branch of the family even more closely to the Austrian branch. Anna of Austria was Philip's niece. From the perspective of preserving dynastic unity, this was excellent policy. From the perspective of the biological mathematics accumulating beneath the surface, it was another fold in an increasingly dense piece of paper. Philip II died in 1598, having ruled the most powerful empire in the world for more than 40 years. His legacy was enormous. His ships had crossed every ocean. His influence had shaped the political geography of 3 continents. He also left behind a family tree that had grown considerably more complex, considerably more recursive, and considerably more difficult for genealogists to untangle than the one he had inherited. And somewhere, in the still expanding charts on the walls of the palace archive, certain lines were beginning to loop back on themselves with a frequency that would have concerned anyone who understood what it meant. Nobody understood what it meant. The next generation would find out. There is a particular experience available to visitors in certain European museum galleries, an experience that is difficult to describe and almost impossible to forget. Once you have had it, you walk into a room dedicated to Habsburg portraiture. The paintings cover the walls from floor to ceiling. Each one is enormous, gilt-framed, lit with the careful reverence that museums extend to important artifacts. The subjects are powerful people, dressed in the most elaborate clothing their era could produce. Armor that gleams, ruffs so large they look like decorative fountains, wigs of increasing ambition as the centuries progress, chains of gold, crowns, globes, swords, every symbol of authority that European royal culture ever developed. And then you look at the faces. At first, the resemblance seems like simple family likeness. Of course, a dynasty would look somewhat similar across generations. Families share features. This is normal, but you keep looking. There is Charles V, early in the gallery, the jaw present, distinct, but within a range that one might call characteristic. A few paintings down, Philip II, the same underlying structure, the same forward angle of the lower face. Then the Spanish branch deepens, and the generations accumulate, and the feature becomes more pronounced with each decade represented. By the time you reach the later Habsburg paintings, the jaw has become architecturally impossible to explain away as simple family resemblance, and the painter's techniques become more evident. The careful upward tilt of the head, the strategic shadow, the elaborate collar drawing the eye. Each painting is an act of professional diplomacy between the artist's obligation to accuracy and their obligation to flattery. The diplomacy gets harder as the dynasty progresses. What you are looking at in that gallery is a visual record of genetic accumulation, a timeline not of wars or treaties, but of the quiet biological consequences of a marriage strategy pursued across 2 centuries. Modern medical researchers examining these portraits have been able to trace the progression of the mandibular prognathism with enough precision to publish academic papers about it. The jawline becomes measurably more pronounced as the inbreeding coefficient increases. The art of a dynasty documents the science of its decline without anyone in the frame understanding what they were recording. The painters never knew they were making a genetic case study. The sitters never knew they were exhibits. Both groups simply showed up, did their jobs, and left behind one of the most extraordinary unintentional datasets in modern medical history. And so we arrive at Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661 to Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, Charles II was, in the arithmetic of Habsburg genealogy, the result of everything the dynasty had been building and failing to notice for generations. His parents were uncle and niece. This was unusual even by Habsburg standards, and yet it had happened before, and the political logic was the same as always. Keep the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family tightly aligned. Prevent the empire from fragmenting into rival claims. But the parents' relationship, close as it was, does not fully capture the depth of what Charles II inherited. When modern geneticists reconstructed his family tree and calculated what researchers call the inbreeding coefficient, a number measuring how closely related a person's parents are, the result was extraordinary. The coefficient for Charles II was roughly equivalent to what you would expect if his parents had been siblings. They were not siblings, but generations of cousin marriages, layered one on top of another, each fold adding thickness to the paper, had created the same effect. Charles II carried more of the same genetic material from fewer distinct ancestors than almost anyone in recorded history outside of deliberately incestuous arrangements. His body announced this immediately. Was a sickly infant. He struggled to walk until approximately age 4, delayed even by the loose standards that royal courts applied to the physical development of children who were carried everywhere and dressed by servants. Speech came late and slowly. Fevers arrived and lingered. The court physicians, those serious men with their herbal preparations and their theories about bodily humors, maintained a near-permanent presence around the royal cradle. None of their treatments were addressing the correct problem. None of them could have Charles grew. Slowly, effortfully, but he grew. The famous Habsburg jaw which had been present in every generation of the dynasty, but had grown more pronounced with each accumulation of close marriages, reached in Charles II its most dramatic expression. His lower jaw extended so far forward that closing his mouth comfortably required real effort. Eating certain foods was genuinely difficult. The royal kitchen adapted accordingly softer preparations, more accommodating textures, while the court maintained the formal pretense that grand royal banquets were proceeding exactly as intended. The portrait painters were given a very difficult brief. They managed it with everything they had. Elaborate collars, strategic lighting, slightly upward tilts. Every technique the genre had developed over a century of Habsburg portraiture was deployed simultaneously, and the result was paintings that were technically flattering, in the sense that they could be described as flattering while still making it absolutely obvious to any viewer paying attention that the subject of the painting had a face unlike any other king in Europe. Charles was crowned king at age 4, following his father's death. He ruled in theory from 1665 until his death in 1700. In practice, he was almost never well enough to rule effectively. Real power flowed through regents, then through competing court factions, then through advisors who managed the machinery of empire while maintaining the careful theatrical fiction that the king was in charge. The king sat through ceremonies. He appeared at official functions when his health permitted. He received ambassadors who wrote careful diplomatic letters, home describing what they had witnessed, letters that, between the lines, said things no ambassador could write directly about a sitting monarch. He tried to produce heirs. He married twice, first Maria Luisa of Orleans, then Mariana of Neuburg. Neither marriage produced a child. The dynasty that had spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of preserving its bloodline was facing the terminal consequence of that preservation. It had distilled its bloodline into a form that could not continue. Europe spent the last decade of Charles II's reign quietly preparing for what everyone understood was coming. This preparation had the outward appearance of ordinary diplomacy. Letters exchanged, alliances discussed, official positions maintained with careful vagueness. But beneath the diplomatic surface, every major power on the continent was doing the same calculation. If Charles dies without a direct heir, the Spanish throne, along with the Spanish Netherlands, large portions of Italy, and the entire overseas empire with its silver and its trade routes, becomes available. France, under Louis XIV, had a claim through family connections. His grandson Philip, Duke of Anjou, had Habsburg blood on his mother's side. If Louis's claim was accepted, France and Spain could find themselves aligned under the same royal house, a combination of power that the rest of Europe found approximately as appealing as a house fire. The Austrian Habsburgs believed the throne should come to them. Same bloodline, same dynasty, different branch. From Vienna's perspective, the inheritance was obvious. England and the Dutch Republic didn't particularly want either option. They wanted, with the desperation of states, that had survived previous European hegemons, for no single power to become too dominant. The negotiations that followed were careful, extensive, and ultimately unsuccessful in their goal of preventing war. Charles II, in his final lucid months, signed a will leaving everything to Philip of Anjou. On November the 1st, 1700, Charles II died at the age of 38. The last Spanish Habsburg was gone. The dynasty that had built itself through weddings, that had accumulated kingdoms through marriage contracts and anniversary dinners, ended not with a battle, not with a revolution, not with any of the dramatic mechanisms by which empires usually fall, but with a sick man dying in his bed, having never managed to produce a child. Philip of Anjou became Philip V of Spain, and Europe, almost immediately, went to war. The War of the Spanish Succession lasted 11 years. 11 years of armies marching across Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, and Spain itself. 11 years of siege warfare, naval engagements, diplomatic maneuvering, and the particular misery of soldiers dying in mud for abstract reasons that the people doing the dying were rarely fully briefed on. The major powers aligned predictably. France and Spain on one side, the Grand Alliance, Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, and various German states on the other. The greatest general produced by this conflict was the Duke of Marlborough, an Englishman whose victories against French forces became the stuff of military legend. Alongside his Austrian counterpart, Prince Eugene of Savoy, Marlborough won battles at Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, names that would echo through English history for generations, eventually producing a famous palace named in celebration of the first. The war dragged on. Then something unexpected happened in 1711. The Austrian Archduke, who was the alliance's preferred candidate for the Spanish throne, suddenly inherited the position of Holy Roman Emperor through the death of his brother. If he also became King of Spain, he would control an empire larger than the one they had gone to war to prevent France from building. The logic of the alliance collapsed. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed. Philip V remained King of Spain, but with conditions. The French and Spanish crowns could never be united under a single ruler. Spain retained its monarchy, but lost several European territories. The balance of power was restored, imperfectly, but sufficiently. And all of this, 11 years of war, thousands of deaths, the redrawing of European borders, the creation of military legends, the reshaping of the continent's political order, traced, ultimately, back to a dynasty that had spent 2 centuries marrying its cousins, and had finally run out of branches to produce an heir. The Habsburg marriage strategy had, in its final act, managed to reshape Europe one last time, not through a wedding, this time through the absence of one. Centuries after the last Spanish Habsburg died in his bed in Madrid, researchers in a very different kind of room, quiet, fluorescent lit, smelling of old paper and digital archive access, began mapping the family tree with tools that no one in a 17th century palace could have imagined. The genealogical records of the Habsburg dynasty are extraordinary. Marriage contracts, birth records, court documents, notarial archives, church records. The paperwork of power survives in remarkable detail. Historians had been studying it for decades. What changed in the modern era was the ability to analyze it mathematically, inbreeding coefficients, calculations of genetic relatedness across generations, systematic tracking of how many times the same ancestors appeared in different positions within a single person's lineage. When researchers ran these calculations on the Habsburg family tree, the results were striking even to people who had been expecting to find something striking. The inbreeding coefficient for Charles II of Spain, calculated from the documented genealogy, was approximately 0.254. For context, the expected coefficient for a child of first cousins is approximately 0.063. The coefficient for a child of siblings is approximately 0.250. Charles II was not the product of siblings, but he was the product of so many generations of close marriages, stacked so consistently that the mathematics of his situation was functionally equivalent. His family tree contained somewhere around 80 distinct ancestors, where a non-inbred individual would expect to find close to 500. The same individuals appeared multiple times in his lineage. His great-grandmother appeared repeatedly, in several different positions simultaneously, because she was connected to him through multiple separate branches of the family. The famous Habsburg jaw, examined across the portrait record by researchers combining art history and medical expertise, showed a measurable increase in severity across the generations of the Spanish branch. It was not a family quirk. It was a genetic signal. The developmental delays, the health fragility, the fertility problems that plagued the later Habsburgs, all consistent with what happens when recessive harmful variants, diluted to invisibility in large populations, are brought together with increasing probability by parents who share too many ancestors. The dynasty had, without knowing it, run a multi-century natural experiment in the effects of sustained inbreeding on a human population. They had documented it meticulously in court records and portrait galleries. They had left behind everything a future scientist would need to understand what had happened. They had simply not known, at the time, that anything was happening. This is, in a way, the strangest part of the entire story. The Habsburg dynasty, viewed from a sufficient distance, resembles something between a tragedy and a parable. They were not villains. They were not careless. They were, by the standards of their time and place, exceptionally sophisticated political operators who built an empire that genuinely reshaped the world. Their marriages were not acts of ignorance. They were acts of strategy, executed with precision, producing results that worked for a very long time. The flaw was not in their intelligence or their intentions. The flaw was in the limits of their knowledge. They were operating in a world before genetics, before the discovery of inheritance mechanisms, before Mendel's P's, before chromosomes, before DNA, before any of the conceptual framework that would eventually allow a person to understand why it might matter at a biological level that your parents share the same great-great-grandparents. In the absence of that framework, the Habsburg strategy was perfectly rational. Keep power inside the family. Preserve alliances through blood ties. Prevent the empire from fragmenting by ensuring that every territory remained connected to every other territory through the web of family relationships. It worked. For generations, it genuinely worked. It was working while it was failing. The portrait painters were adjusting their lighting while the family tree was folding inward. The court physicians were debating humors while recessive traits were accumulating. The royal advisors were planning the next strategic marriage while the genetic deck was being shuffled with an ever smaller stack of cards. And nobody in any of those rooms could have told you what was happening. Not because they were incompetent, but because the knowledge required to understand it hadn't been invented yet. The Habsburg story is, among other things, a reminder that the most consequential forces shaping history are not always the ones that anyone involved understands. Wars are conspicuous. Diplomacy is documented. Marriages are celebrated with wine and music and official proclamations. What happens in the genetic material of a dynasty's bloodline generates no paperwork. It requires no ambassadors. It is not subject to negotiation or royal decree. It simply accumulates quietly, generation after generation, until the accumulation becomes too large to ignore. And then it becomes, as the Habsburgs eventually became, one of the most famous cautionary examples in the history of biology. The candles in the great halls have burned down to their copper holders. Outside, somewhere in a city that was once Habsburg territory, church bells are marking an hour that everyone in the palace would have been able to identify by sound. The servants have retreated. The portrait gallery is dark. The genealogical charts are still spread across the archive tables, but no one is reading them walk, for a moment, through that darkened gallery. The faces stare at you from their gilded frames, not following you with the animated malevolence of Gothic fiction, but simply present, fixed in the amber of oil and canvas. Charles V in his armor, Philip II in his black, the Spanish branch deepening, feature by feature, generation by generation. Charles II at the end of the corridor, the final portrait of the line, the jaw that painters ran out of tricks to disguise. They were all doing what humans do, trying to protect their families, trying to hold power across time, trying to guarantee that what they had built would survive them. In that, at least, they were entirely ordinary. The tools they used, marriage, genealogy, bloodline, were the best tools available for the problem as they understood it. The problem they were actually facing, the quiet accumulation happening beneath the portraits and the ceremonies, and the carefully arranged weddings, required tools that did not yet exist. History is full of this pattern. Intelligent people working with incomplete information, building systems that function magnificently until they encounter the boundary of what the builders could see. The Habsburg dynasty reached that boundary in 1700. The empire fragmented. The portraits stayed on the walls. The family tree, meticulously documented in archives across Europe, became a case study that would eventually be studied by people using equipment the last Spanish Habsburg could not have conceived. And the lesson, if there is one neat lesson, which history usually resists providing, might be this: systems built around preservation eventually encounter the cost of what they refuse to let change. The Habsburgs preserved their bloodline so carefully that it stopped being able to produce a future, which is, all things considered, a strange kind of success. Outside your window tonight, the city is quiet. The church bells have stopped. The world that the Habsburgs built, the cities, the trade routes, the borders redrawn after the War of the Spanish Succession, the galleries still hanging their portraits. All of it continues, reshaped, but present. Your family tree, whatever its particular shape, is almost certainly not a loop. Take a moment to appreciate that. Good night.